Throughout this course, you will see a number of different people who are presenting their ideas. Not all of these ideas will be consistent with each other, so you may see some conflicting issues brought up. Even amongst academic scholars that are presenting their work, you may see conflicting ideas, or you may see where a cultural expert says one thing and one of the academic scholars seems to say something that's the opposite. That's okay. One of the take-home messages that you should be getting is that not everybody in the world sees the world the same way, and that's okay. You need to be deciding how you see the world, and you need to be able, obviously, to figure out how to answer questions on an exam. What we're not trying to do in this course is get you to only think one way. We want you to be open to the possibility that there's more than one way to resolve problems. There's more than one way to put together your thoughts. And this is really important. This is played out in lots of different interesting ways. It's played out in different languages. There are things that we can talk about and think about in one language that are really awkward to talk about and think about in another. Any of you who speak multiple languages, you know what I'm talking about. When you shift gears and go from this language to that one, suddenly your abilities to talk and think about things change in some big ways sometimes. In other ways, you can just translate straight across and it seems to be equivalent. And that's the same when we're looking at the different cultural perspectives. Sometimes, from a scientific cultural perspective, we can talk about something and it's got a perfectly good equivalent in another culture. But other times, there just really isn't an equivalent. And so there isn't really a way for science to talk about something in another culture, or vice versa. There isn't a way for another culture to talk about something that's in science. So we just have to accept that that's the way things are, and that's okay. The speakers for this course will include a range of perspectives, and this is our goal, is to constantly be providing you with different ways of seeing things, provided by academic scientists, because they're the ones that are paid to put this course together and are expected to be teaching it. However, that aside, as an ethnobotanist, I think it's pretty important that you hear about culture from the mouths of cultural practitioners. And so we try to mix in the perspectives of cultural practitioners as often as we can. And I apologize if it's not often enough. That's our weakness as scholars. That's not your weakness as a student, nor the weakness of the practitioners. You'll hear from a number of different ethnobotanists. Ethnobotanists are a unique group of scientists, largely because each of us is trained differently. There's no two of us that are really trained in the same way. Ethnobotany is just now really becoming a discipline where you can earn a degree in it. In my time, which isn't that far back, if you wanted to become an ethnobotanist, you had to study something else and glue several pieces together. So in my case, I've glued anthropology with botanical systematics, and that forms the basis of my background, kind of with a sprinkling of pharmacology. But other people are going to have different backgrounds. Some people are primarily trained in agriculture or food sciences. Others are primarily trained in cultural anthropology, or it could be in pharmacology. It could be in a lot of different kinds of fields, linguistics, lots of things. And so it's important to realize that each of these sciences really are kind of a different culture and language themselves. So just the same way we might have a group of related cultures, say French, Italians, and Spanish, that all have common linguistic elements, scientists are the same way. They all have common language elements, but the same way those languages have their own uniquenesses. The same is true of scientific disciplines. And so each ethnobotanist brings to bear the strengths and weaknesses of their particular discipline. And so, you need to keep that in mind when you're watching a particular ethnobotanist present their ideas. They have some strengths and they have some weaknesses. I have some strengths and I have some weaknesses. In addition to cultural experts and ethnobotanists, we also present some other kinds of experts. One of the great things about the kinds of work that we do is that we get to learn from people who have lots of different kinds of expertise. This can include architects, engineers, mathematicians, astronomers, lots of different kinds of people with expertise. I think I've probably learned about as much from cooks and chefs as I have from fellow botanists. And you might think, wow, you know, those cooks and a chef, that's not somebody who's a scientist. It's not, but it's somebody who has a level of expertise that allows them to make decisions about the way something important in our lives goes. Certainly we spend far more time eating than we do almost anything else in life besides sleeping. And so, you know, a cook has a lot to say about how our life functions. As you listen to the different speakers in this class, you're probably going to be wanting to take notes about what they say. You may want to review pieces of their work. Try to come to grips with the big picture of what each speaker talks about. These are the kinds of things that you're generally tested on. What are the big issues? You'll see plant names listed on some of the presentations that are given in here. Jot down those plant names. If we've gone to the effort of giving you a local name and a scientific name, it's probably worth knowing. If in the course of the discussion somebody happens to use a name and it doesn't pop up on the screen, it probably means we didn't think it was important enough for you to have to learn it. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means you probably don't have to know it for an examination. If you're a real go-getter, you'll want to learn all those names, because there's a lot that's tied up in names. And this is both the scientific names and the names that are found in a particular culture. They're much more than just tags. They contain a lot of useful information. And as you start to learn them, you'll start to flesh that out and find out what some of the other usefulnesses are. One of the questions that comes up is exactly what is a culture? And a lot of people argue about this. There are large bodies of work written by anthropologists that discuss what is culture. You know, so as a botanist, I'm kind of poorly equipped to say this is what a culture is. As a biologist, I could probably tell you that a culture consists of a bunch of bacteria living in a media, and you know, maybe it becomes yogurt and you eat it. That's a culture. Some of the key aspects of culture include language, beliefs, and shared experiences. People who consider themselves to be members of a culture typically share a common language, and they have a way to talk to each other about things. They have some shared experiences. Those may be their own experiences, or they may be experiences of ancestors that are passed down to them through genealogies, through histories, through stories, lots of other ways, song, dance. And they have a set of shared values that they use to evaluate the world and that they can use to communicate with each other in ways that they feel are appropriate. Any culture that is functional has these kinds of features to it. Ethnobotany is kind of a funny term. It gets used by different people to mean different things. So I'm going to provide you with a definition, and this is a definition that is pretty functional amongst the largest group of scientists who call themselves ethnobotanists. Now there are some other people who call themselves ethnobotanists that are not scientists, and so I'm not trying to define them for themselves, but just this is what most of us who call ourselves ethnobotanists as scientists say. The simple definition of ethnobotany is that it is the scientific study of interactions between people and plants. It's just that simple. We're studying interactions. We're not studying plants, and we're not studying people. We're studying the interactions between the two. And so because of that, ethnobotany is kind of in a funny position. We're at the crossroads between what's traditionally been the domain of anthropologists and other social scientists and the domain of biologists, particularly botanists. So we need to be able to know a little bit about both kinds of ways of thinking. And so this means that we draw a lot upon botanical sciences and the way that botanists describe the world, and we draw a lot upon cultural anthropologists and ethnographers in the way that they study the world and think about it. What ethnobotany is not, is it is not the study of useful plants. We have another discipline that's called economic botany, which by definition is the study of the usefulness of plants and how they are important in cultures. It's not necessarily the study of how to make something economically useful, but it's kind of like home economics. Home economics is the study of the usefulness of things around the home and how to be useful in the home. The same is true of economic botany. Ethnobotany is not the study of cultural knowledge of plants. Some people get hung up on that. Cultural knowledge plays a huge role in what ethnobotany is, but that's not what we specifically study. We're not just honing in on cultural knowledge. Instead, we're looking at that dynamic, that interaction. Ethnobotany is not learning how to know plants. How do I identify plants? That's really the domain of botany. It's not learning how do I make things. Ethnobotany is not a craft class. It's not intended to teach you how to do things. One of the big problems that I see is that a lot of times students seem to think that if they study ethnobotany, they're going to learn how to be functional in a particular culture. And yet that is not what ethnobotanists are trying to do. If you want to learn how to be functional in a culture, the simple hint is learn in the culture. You go and you learn at the feet of somebody who is a cultural practitioner. That's the whole point of culture. And ethnobotany is not intended to be a substitute for that. I really don't think that you can learn any culture other than the culture of science within a scientific institution, because that's what the institution is there to teach, is the culture of science. It's not there to teach anything else. Individual culture consists of 3 different elements, and the first of these is transferred cultural knowledge. This is basically everything that you learned from your parents growing up. They transferred to you their values, their beliefs, their language, everything about their culture they tried to transfer to you. They also tried to transfer to you what they learned as far as making mistakes and things like this. So things that didn't work so well, they tried to improve in you. This is a really important part of the practice of culture. You also learned things from your friends. You learn things from teachers. You learn things from the television. You learn things from all kinds of other places. All of that stuff is transferred culture. If you learn something from somewhere else, it's transferred culture. And this is probably the biggest chunk of what makes up each of us as we practice our individual culture. The second piece of individual culture is personal experiences. So throughout your life, you have experienced life from your own perspective, not from somebody else's perspective, but from your own. And your experiences are uniquely yours. They're different from what anybody else has experienced. This composes the second biggest chunk of what makes up personal culture. The third piece of personal culture is the smallest, and yet it's probably the most important as far as what happens in the long term with culture. And this is any individual innovations that you've had. Now, you may think that you've never done anything unique in your life, but you probably have done something. All of us have done something unique. We've done something a little different than the way we were taught to do it. We've had an experience that nobody else had, and we drew a conclusion from it that maybe nobody else has ever thought before, or was at least unique to us. We've got something that we can point to and say, yes, this is an individual innovation. Now, there's some people with really huge brains who probably have had a lot of individual innovations. But even with them, this is still probably a lesser category than their personal experiences and the transferred culture. Well, why are these individual innovations so important? Well, if you think about it, individual innovations added up over many, many generations as they get passed on as culture experience that's taught to the next generation really is the basis for why cultures all around the world are different from each other. And so it's not the transferred culture that explains why cultures are different. It's those individual innovations accumulating over many generations that account for differences in cultures. And so a lot of what we're interested in as ethnobotanists is these accumulated differences in innovations. And those innovations are directly related to the experiences of individuals, and the experiences of individuals are directly related to the environments in which they live. So if you have somebody that lives in a particular plant environment, say they live in a forest, they're going to have certain kinds of experiences, and they're likely to have certain kinds of innovations that occur to them. And this helps drive the way that cultures change and evolve over time. And it's really important to realize that cultures do change and evolve. They're not static. One generation is going to be slightly different than the next, no matter how good they are at passing on knowledge. And in general, cultures are very good at passing on knowledge. Each generation makes some choices. They may accept almost everything that they learned from their elders. And they may try their best to do things even exactly the same way as their elders did. Yet, there'll still be some subtle differences. Sometimes they're accidental differences, sometimes they're intentional differences, but there'll be differences. And this is one of the fascinating things about culture and change over time. One question that comes up is culture genetic? Is it inherited in a genetic sense? Some people argue that it is, that if you want to be a participant in a particular culture, that you need to have a certain genetic heritage. However, in many cultures around the world, that's not considered to be the prime way that culture is inherited. In many cultures, individuals who are from other lineages can learn a particular piece of knowledge, they can be adopted into a community, they can grow up and live their life as a member of that particular culture. In other cases, that's not allowed. This is an issue that we're just not going to address in this course because it's a controversial one, and frankly, it probably doesn't matter. But for many people, this is an issue that they want to think about. Just because your parents and your grandparents came from a particular lineage and held certain cultural views, does that mean that you hold the same cultural views and that you live the same lifestyle? What does it say? Or do you develop a new culture that's different from that of your grandparents? The second issue that comes up about culture is, what is the role of language? Many people have argued that if you want to be a participant in a particular culture, you must speak the language of that culture. I would argue that if you want to understand something about a culture in any depth at all, you really have to understand the language in which the cultural knowledge is encapsulated, because it's in the expression of language and in the carrying on of conversations in a language that you really learn what culture is about. That's the way culture is transmitted from one generation to the next. So many things are very difficult to translate between languages, particularly between languages that are very distant. And this is probably due to differing experiences that related to development of those languages. It's due to different accumulations of observations that have come about in the past and have been passed down through those languages. Also, languages are very location specific. If I have a language that is functional in the Arctic and it's able to teach me about a particular environment, say in northern Canada, that language may not have the vocabulary to talk about things in the tropics of Brazil. They may not have the language to talk about the plants and animals and so forth that are there. And the reverse would be true. The language from someplace in Brazil might not be terribly functional in the Arctic of Canada. And so languages are place-specific. That doesn't mean that they can't be used elsewhere, but it means that a large body of the vocabulary and the way of thinking about the world is related to a place. So the corollary of this would be that if you really want to understand a place, you really need to understand the language of that place, the language that developed in that place. This is why, as ethnobotanists, we usually try to learn the languages that are endemic to a particular region, languages that have developed over many generations in a particular place. Within this ethnobotany course, we will try to get across to you the culture that is ethnobotany, if there is such a thing. So we're going to assume that there is. And so that means that we're going to be giving you some transferred cultural knowledge. That's a lot of what you're going to have to learn and repeat back on exams. This is accumulated knowledge, as we've indicated, from lots of different kinds of sources. You're going to have some personal experiences. You'll experience some things while you're watching these videos. You'll have some experiences in the workshop portions of the course. You'll have some experiences in the field trips. You'll have lots of different kinds of experiences. Hopefully, along the way, you'll have some individual innovations that occur. If you don't have individual innovations, I think we'll feel like we failed as teachers. So we really want you to have some breakthroughs in the way that you think about the world, particularly as it relates to plants and your personal culture. One issue that comes up with many students is that they get concerned about the fact that there's variation in culture and that there's variation in cultural experiences. So, for instance, there's a tendency for people to want to know the way that a particular culture did something. What are the plants that are used for house thatch in ancient Hawaii? They want to know an answer to that. They want to be able to memorize it and put it on an exam. Well, the simple fact of the matter is that within any culture, there is variation. Sometimes it's variation that's based upon individual skill. Some people are simply better at doing things or more creative than others. Sometimes it's based upon resources availability. In some place, somebody may have access to a particular plant resource. In another place, a person may have access to a different resource. And so they use what they have. There's a lot of reasons why variation occurs. But the simple fact of the matter is that you just have to get over it. We will frequently teach you a use of a plant. The implication that some people come away with is that this is, on the one hand, the only use of that plant, and on the other hand, that this is the correct use of that plant in a particular culture. And you just have to realize there's not necessarily a correct way. There are ways that work and that people have learned over time are functional and useful. And there are ways that don't really work very well and are not very functional. And I think that's probably a healthier way to think about cultural uses of plants and cultural interactions with plants. A question that comes up often is, how do we document the fact that there's variation in the way that people interact with plants? The answer to this is that we try to just tell what we learn. So if a particular person tells you that they use a plant in a certain way and they tell you that it means a certain thing to them, rather than suddenly jumping up to a higher level and reporting that their whole culture uses that plant that way and feels about it that way, it's more appropriate to report that that person uses that plant that way and feels about it that way. And so the better ethnobotanical research that's been done reports information that is either statistically developed about a culture as a whole by sampling a large number of people, or reports specifically the thoughts and feelings and interactions that a particular individual or maybe a family has. And so that's probably the better way to approach things, is to be specific. The problem is, and you'll find this when you write your research papers, is that the overwhelming majority of the literature that's out there reports uses and interactions with plants as if they were general across the culture. It will say, culture X uses plant Y for purpose Z. And it makes it sound like everybody in the culture uses the same plant for the same purpose, and that's just not true. So when we're gathering information in order to understand what's going on within a particular culture, we have a number of different kinds of sources we can turn to. People will turn to old documents that are written by people from outside of a culture. In Hawaii, we have lots of records from ship's officers who wrote their observations, we have missionaries who wrote their observations, and we have a variety of other people who wrote down what they saw, heard, and learned and were told. And these have a certain amount of value. They shouldn't just be completely discarded. However, we need to keep in mind that these people had their own cultural perspective and that they were looking at the rest of the world through the lens of their own culture. And so it means sometimes they saw things that may not have been there. Other times they interpreted things in a way that may not have really been an accurate interpretation. And sometimes they saw things and reported them exactly as they were. And it's a little bit hard to sort that all out. A second group of people that report on culture are people from within the culture. And people from within the culture oftentimes report things exactly as they are occurring from within the culture, particularly from their own individual perspective. It may not be the perspective held by everybody, but it's probably closer to it than an outsider's perspective. There are strengths and weaknesses of learning from people within a culture and from people from outside a culture. And the real trick is to learn to take advantage of the strengths and weaknesses of both groups of people. So, what are these? Well, people from outside of a culture usually can see the big picture quite well, and they see things that are very different, particularly things that are different than their own culture would have. But they miss the fine details. However, the opposite is true of people within a culture. A lot of times they don't have enough experience with other cultures to know what is really unique about their own culture, although this is changing in many parts of the world. People within a culture have a strength of seeing the subtleties and the variations within their own culture. They can see kind of the full range of what's going on. And a lot of times they will be careful to note details that others might miss. One issue that's kind of important to think about is that not all members of a particular culture know all knowledge of their culture. And so we can't learn everything from one individual. So what this means is that as ethnobotanists, we oftentimes are interviewing different people about different kinds of knowledge and trying to learn specifics from experts within a community. It also means that not all ethnobotanists are appropriately suited to ask all kinds of questions. So to give a very easy example, I have virtually no musical talent, skills, nor background. I can barely appreciate music. I listen to it and I say something sounds fine to me. That's the extent of my skills. However, I have a fair amount of expertise in the study of plants. And so when I'm working with people, and they're talking about plants, they tend to give me some fairly advanced knowledge about plants. They can tell that I can understand what they're talking about. When they're talking about music, they tend to give me the 5-year-old's version, because that's about the level I can understand music. I just don't have a deep sense for it. Now, there's other people who understand music at a very finely detailed level. And if they were to interview somebody about music, they would get an advanced level of knowledge. Whereas if they were to interview somebody about plants and they didn't know much about plants, once again, they would get the 5-year-old's level of knowledge. And this is really important to think about. When you're learning from a literature source, when you're learning from somebody such as an ethnobotanist, it's important to consider what their real level of expertise is, what their level of expertise is in their own culture, because that will limit what they know in another culture or can learn from another culture.